You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The United States scales back its military presence in Syria, but why is it still there at all? Are the differences between French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni the kind of thing which can be ironed out over an agreeable dinner? And how enthused would you be about an American holiday this summer? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Kate Clark and John Everard will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Patrick Strickland about his new book, recalling the regrettable rise and merciful fall of the Greek fascist party Golden Dawn. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by John Everard, former British ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and Kate Clark, former BBC correspondent and currently co-director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network. Hello to you both.
Hi there.
Hi.
Kate, first of all, you have recently been, as I understand it, analysing Afghanistan with your network in Istanbul.
That's right. There was a conference the Danish Military College and a Pakistani think tank, and they got a whole load of people together to discuss engaging with the Taliban.
And what is the consensus on how good an idea that is?
It was very wide-ranging, as you can imagine. There were some female activists who said, no way, nothing should happen. There were also some women there, Afghan women there, who said it has to go ahead because of the benefits for the Afghan people. Really tricky, really tricky.
This would be the ruthlessly pragmatic assessment of the situation that as long as they're in charge, we kind of have to deal with.
Yeah.
It is tricky.
Yeah. And we're almost 4 years on since they took power. They're quite jealous of the Syrians because, ex-Al-Qaeda Ashara stormed into Damascus, military victory, rather like the Taliban, and they got their sanctions lifted. Taliban still, almost 4 years in power, and they still have sanctions. They still have all their assets frozen. Why us, they say. But then, of course, they won't fight, Al-Sharaa wasn't fighting the Americans, so...
Well, indeed not. We will be turning shortly to the subject of the Americans in Syria. John, meanwhile, you have been visiting Tokyo.
I have been visiting Tokyo, attending a big forum full of very, very nervous Japanese and, interestingly, equally nervous Chinese, all trying to work out what President Trump is going to do in his next incarnation, and thought that I was going to be able to tell them. So I sort of smiled, ate my four-course meals and explained that actually I had no more idea than anybody else, probably no more idea than Donald Trump himself, who appears to make up policy depending on what he had for breakfast that morning. So we didn't actually come to any great conclusions, but it was a good place to meet people and to share hand-wringing.
Well, we will start with one of Donald Trump's more recent whims in Syria, where flags will shortly be furled at all but one of the 8 US military bases still operating in the country. Late last year, around the time of the fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the US Department of Defense confirmed that about 2,000 American soldiers were stationed in Syria, the latest iteration of a deployment which began a decade ago during the war against Islamic State, a conflict which sputters still, and in which the Americans have been fighting alongside various Kurdish and Arab militias. Around 20 US service personnel and contractors are known to have been killed in Syria. Kate, first of all, is this a big deal, or is this just America recognising that circumstances in Syria have changed, well, rather extravagantly, and we don't really need all these people there anymore?
Well, I think it's a Trump thing not to have US deployed overseas. So he wanted it last time, didn't do it. So I think that's probably what's behind it. But of course, Syria has changed utterly. I was there just before the war, and I'm hoping to go again. But if you think about just how much has changed in the Middle East, Iran is now a paper tiger. Israel is occupying parts of Syria. You've got Turkey in the north, who have got their own issues with the Kurds. The Gulf states, particularly Qatar and Saudi, they're deadly rivals, but they're on board with Syria because they don't want it becoming chaotic and violent again. And meanwhile, in the middle, you've got al-Shara trying to hold everything together. So he's pleased he's going to get the sanctions lifted. I think the Americans leaving, I'm not sure that's too important, apart from for the Kurds, because they felt protected. That's the Kurds in the northeast.
Indeed so. Is it significant in that context, John, that they're not leaving entirely? At least one US base is going to be maintained. Why would America still want at least a small oar in Syria?
This is the question that is causing so many military analysts to scratch their heads. I mean, essentially, if you deploy so as to project credible military force. And 8 bases across the north, from that point of view, made quite a lot of sense. Either you do that or you don't. Going down to one base leaves you between two stools. One base isn't actually going to cut the mustard if things start to get rough in Syria, and it's still going to put a lot of American soldiers on the front line, probably under-supported and under-resourced. Frankly, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, given all that, Kate, is this really a major recalibration? There's a quote from Thomas Barak, who's the US ambassador to Turkey and the Syria envoy, and he said, "What I can assure you is that our current Syria policy will not be close to the Syria policy of the last 100 years, because none of those have worked."
I was absolutely astounded by that comment. We talk about 1925.
Yeah, he may just have reached for a convenient round number. I'm not even sure the US had a Syria policy in 1925.
Well, they did actually invent the term Middle East at that point, because the Near East was the Balkans and Greece.
Fair
so
point.
The Americans, but they weren't particularly involved. Of course, it was the British and the French that were carving up the Middle East post the First World War at that point. They were the big players. I was bemused by that, and unfortunately, it's not the first time that an American envoy has said something that you think, what? Do they actually read their history books? Possibly not.
John, is he entirely wrong, though? I mean, if what he is suggesting, and if we say the sort of past 100 years is a bit of knockabout hyperbole, is he necessarily wrong to suggest that, let's say, more recent US policy in Syria is not the stuff which will be taught in how to do foreign policy lectures decades hence?
He may be half right. I mean, certainly there have been a lot of problems with US policy in Syria, perhaps not going back to 1925, you're quite right, but in recent years. That does not mean, of course, that his recalibration, to use his word, of policy is going to bring any better results. And the timing is strange too, isn't it? I mean, while you had Syria under a hostile dictatorship, having US troops, 2000, we now learn, might not have actually changed things very much, but Syria has now changed dramatically. And it's just the moment when having that weight of troops on the ground might actually have made a difference. And just now he chooses to bring them out.
I don't know. I mean, I think I write about Afghanistan, and when Assad fell, I thought one of the best advantages the new government had was that America wasn't involved. They were such a dreadful force in Afghanistan and Iraq. And, Syria has neighbours to contend with. They've got Israel that has launched hundreds of attacks since Assad fell. It's occupying parts of the country. And it's been openly calling for the breakup of Syria. So it's not that there aren't hostile forces, but at least you don't have the Americans telling you what to do. Often from a point of ignorance, it has to be said.
Just finally on exactly that, John, and this is where I will invite you to play counterfactual slightly, because it does strike me as one of the big ones of the entire 21st century. President Barack Obama did speak when he left office of regrets over Syria, and what it was generally assumed he was alluding to was 2013-14. He'd laid down the red line about chemical weapons. Assad stepped across it, defying Obama. Obama did not react. at least not in the way that people had imagined he might. And Obama said at the time, unless we were all in and willing to take over Syria, we were going to have problems. Everything else was tempting because we wanted to do something, but it was going to be impossible to do this on the cheap. And in that circumstance, I have to make a decision as president as to what is best, and I'm sorry. But the question is, supposing he makes the other decision, are we in a better world now?
Hey, that is quite a counterfactual, isn't it? I mean, we don't know. So much depends on who the Americans put in to run the place. Iraq was a disaster. I think we can agree on that. Afghanistan, well, I'll leave that to Kate to talk about. Japan, they did very well. I mean, MacArthur actually created large parts of modern Japan simply by listening to people, not a strong American skill in other fora, and respecting the way that the Japanese wanted to do things. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they've been effective. It depends entirely on who you put in, how you support them, what kind of mission statement you give them. And without knowing that, even a counterfactual answer is going to be a bit tricky.
Well, to Rome now, where Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been hosting French President Emmanuel Macron, who may not have entirely wanted to be there. The two have obvious enough political differences. Meloni, a nationalist conservative, Macron, a centrist technocrat, and are widely reputed to nonplus each other personally. She, a working-class outsider, he an insider to the point of self-parody. They have, however, both been pretty solid on Ukraine and probably Europe's most pressing present concern, that is, right now. That was an elegantly put sentence. John, first of all, drawing upon your experience of diplomacy, how much difference to a big thing might a small thing like whether or not two particular leaders happen to get on make?
It can make a very big difference. Even now, even with the armies of diplomats the nation states deploy and the complexity of international relations, relations between leaders still counts for a great deal. And in the European context, Meloni and Macron don't have to like each other, but they just have to stop sparring. I mean, various Italian commentators have been saying that the kind of puppet show that they have been putting on for the last couple of years has been thoroughly embarrassing. You know, these sort of almost trivial spats. And the fact that Macron has gone to Rome specifically to see Meloni, I'm sure will cause sighs of relief in chancellors across Europe. I
mean, are they perhaps, and this is possibly a generous assessment, Kate, both burdened by what is imposed on them by outside observers? This idea that they represent these two opposed ideas of what Europe could or should be?
Isn't it more pragmatic than that? Isn't there the pressing need at the moment to have a concerted policy on Ukraine?
One would hope so.
Together, and in the embrace of the Trump presidency as well, which has changed. I think it's definitely changed how Britain feels about the EU. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Labour Party would have tended there anyway, but it's made it easier for Britain and the EU to talk to each other, and presumably it's made it easier for those within the EU, and it's not everyone, who feels strongly about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to get on a bit better and to work together.
That is also true. And on that front, John, again, drawing upon your experience of deciphering diplomatese into readily understandable English, the official French statement ahead of this, and I want you to tell me what volume of gritted French teeth you detect here, is Prime Minister Meloni is part of the collective format of the coalition of the willing. Italy is an important partner.
Yes. A little bit of grinding of teeth in the background there. But, of course, the statement as it stands boldly is true. Nobody can contest what's in there. The problem that it doesn't address is that although she may be part of the coalition of the willing, there's willing and willing, isn't there? And Meloni has absented herself from certain key meetings and made clear that Italy is in no hurry to send any troops to Ukraine. One of her big things in Italy has been anti-militarism. And she's not going to blow that domestic platform just for Ukraine.
Well, on that thought, there is willing and there is willing. That is true. There's also, Kate, anti-militarism and anti-militarism. In basic real numbers, Italy has sent less military aid than either Finland or Belgium to Ukraine. It might, in terms of defence spending, stumble over 2% of GDP this year. I stress might. And though Meloni has talked to many a surprisingly solid game on Ukraine, this isn't really good enough, is it?
And that's less in actual terms than Finland and wow, and it's the third biggest economy in the EU, so it is relatively even smaller. Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I think you answered your question, didn't you? Obviously, the further you get from Ukraine, the further away the war is. I think that's quite clear as well, that it's less of a threat. And the countries nearer Ukraine and nearer Russia, they're either thinking, oh, we'd better keep in with the big bear, or they are really upping their defence spending and their precautions.
I mean, all of which is true and is a complaint that has been made many times, John, about many of those countries closer to Russia. But does it surprise you how enduring that thought seems to be among Western European countries that Ukraine is all the way over there? Because it's really not. It is actually quite close.
A far-off country of which we know little, as I think someone once said.
Yes.
It's. I'm not sure how far those who go around dismissing the importance of what's going on in Ukraine actually believe it. I think there's a great deal of cognitive dissonance and simple wishful thinking going on. But I agree with Kate. I mean, I think it's good that the threat of Ukraine, Trump has brought these two sparring partners together. I can't resist pointing out at this point that you have to pinch yourself to remember that back in March, Meloni was going around looking very smug, convinced she was going to be Trump's woman in the EU. Trump tendencies, parallel policies, all these kind of things, occasional friendly phone calls. But no, I mean, she gets her wrist slapped heavily by the Trump administration for, as you rightly point out, grossly inadequate spending on defence. She gets the same tariffs slapped on her as the rest of the EU, and all of a sudden, Meloni wakes up and decides she needs friends.
Well, possibly more constructively and hopefully and optimistically, Kate. Also visiting Rome now is Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico, who is one of those Eastern European leaders to whom you allude, whose views on Russia we could charitably describe as equivocal. Is there a role that Meloni could play here in bringing some of her more, I guess, swivel-eyed right-wing leaders on board?
That's a very good question. Why? I mean, there's friendly chats, isn't there, between leaders, and then as I came back to it, there's pragmatic decision making, and just because someone is right wing, and there's another right wing leader, does that necessarily persuade anyone? Because the Slovakian leadership has come down on a policy that it thinks suits Slovakia. Maybe he'll persuade Meloni that.
Is there diplomatic advice that someone could give to Meloni about how to wrangle Robert Fico, John?
Yes, a basic tenet of diplomacy. Work out whose mind you can change and concentrate on them. If you conclude that somebody is so deep-rooted in a position that you're not going to shift them, leave them alone. And I'm pretty sure I know where both Fico and Orbán stand on that.
Well, let's stick with the theme of attempts to conjure unity in arguably unpropitious circumstances and look at South Korea, which has sworn in a new president, replacing one who was widely sworn at. Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party won yesterday's election reasonably comfortably, 8 points clear of principal rival Kim Moon-soo of People Power, whose cause was doubtless not helped by the fact that he shares a party affiliation with South Korea's previous president, Yoon Suk-yeol, currently awaiting trial on charges of insurrection pertaining to his still not altogether explained attempt of last December to impose martial law. Lee Jae-myung kicked his presidency off by promising to unite his bewildered country. John, politicians always say that when they're sworn in. Just once, in fact, I would like to see a politician newly elected saying, "I will sow division, rancor, and general brouhaha." They're never going to do that. In this specific context, how do we like his chances?
You've heard of snowballs in hell? Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't have to say, I'm going to sow division and rancor. There's so much of that around anyway. All he's got to do is to sit back and let that happen. He's trying to do this with one hand tied behind his back because Li is himself a deeply divisive figure, pursued by various legal agencies over corruption, facing a trial still over abuse of the electoral law, and a reputation of something of a, how shall I put this polite, something of a rough diamond. Convincing when you said, yes, he beat the PPP, Yoon Suk-yeol's old party. I mean, if he had failed with that, then there would have been gasps of astonishment. But people were predicting a landslide victory. He didn't even get half of the popular vote. It shows that, I mean, OK, he's won fair and square. That's beyond question. But there is a very strong anti-Lee vote out there. A lot of people will be glad to see Yoon Suk-yeol go, but really won't be cheering from the sidelines when Lee Jae-myung takes his office.
Did he have supporters within his party? Because, I mean, was he voted in because most people didn't like the alternative?
Effectively, yes. I mean, as in so many elections in so many countries, most people in South Korea appear to have voted not for somebody, but against somebody.
I mean, but also, as we've seen in elections around the world in, Earth's most famous democracy, most obviously, you can still get a point in which a particular leader, Kate, or a political party have stepped so far beyond what you think are the bounds of reasonable behaviour that you're amazed that anybody votes for them at all. And yet People Power still get 41% for their candidate.
Yeah, it's amazing. I would actually like our friend to talk about this. He's the ex-ambassador to North Korea. I feel that you probably have much more interesting things to say about this for the listeners.
I think, I don't know if it's interesting, but one of the problems that Lee faces is that an awful lot of South Koreans do actually believe that Yoon Suk-yeol was right to declare martial law. Now, this is difficult to grasp if you're brought up in a West European democracy, but the distrust of the left in South Korea amongst right-wing politicians and right-wing voters, and the belief that the left is actually just a front for North Korea, runs very deep. And even now, there have been people on the street of Seoul protesting that Yoon Suk-yeol should not face any kind of legal proceedings and that he is in fact a national hero. Lee has got quite a hill to climb.
Just on that thought, though, John, what should be his first steps up it? Again, I'm now asking you, having previously asked you to advise Giorgia Meloni, asking you to advise South Korea's new president. He is president now. That buys you a bit of wiggle room, ideally. So what do you do with it?
Well, that's two consultants, isn't it? They'll be double paid. I think one almost throwaway line in his speech suggested that he might be bringing on board some people from the PPP, Yoon Suk-yeol's old party. And Kim Mun-soo, the man he's just defeated in the election, is relatively untainted, a good technocrat. One thing he might do would be to bring him into government at some level, just to show willing and show that he is, as he says, a president of all Koreans.
Kate, just to universalise this one somewhat finally, do you see in what South Korea has done in response to a president veering off the rails something of an example which we might wish other countries had followed, i.e. just deal with it decisively and swiftly, apply the law to whoever it is, rather than faffing around for 4 years hoping that a plurality of your fellow citizens don't re-elect him?
Yeah, and then you've got a problem with the courts, who are still seen as toothless, I would say, in America, or at least slow and vulnerable. And at the moment, given the way that the Trump administration has taken power and used it, many people would say illegally, so interfering in matters that are Congress's purview, claiming that emergency powers allow it to do that, and then it has to row back, or maybe it does, but it's already destroyed a lot of things. That's a real mess. But I think from an outsider's point of view, it was so clear that the attack on the Capitol, 4 years ago, was illegal. But then what do you do when you've got half the population who clearly didn't bother them that much?
Well, yeah, a question I suspect we do not have time to answer today, but we can go now to the United States and the tourist industry of which is absorbing the consequences of potential visitors to their country having to now consider the possibility that their American holiday could end in the barber's chair at a Salvadoran supermax. The Marriott hotel chain, for one, is, it says here, optimistic-ish, but has noticed that folk are reluctant to book too far in advance. The average for either business or work travel is down to 21 days. Kate, first of all, the thing that astonished me here was like, who on earth thinks 21 days ahead? I can barely think 21 minutes ahead. So are you a careful, meticulous travel planner or one of those creatures of whim?
I'm a really poor forward planner. And, you know, my favourite trips are when I go to see people. And they've organised my trip, so I don't have to do any of that. So I tend to revolve holidays around friends who live in nice places rather than my own work in planning.
Okay.
And I really hate 5-star hotels. So, you know, that's my last resort. I remember in the BBC that I used to work with, they put me up in the very posh hotel in the middle of Cairo, and I had to beg the guards to bring me proper bread because the stuff they were giving me in the restaurant was inedible.
John, looking at the US specifically, are you less enthused about travelling there than you might have been a year ago?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I think I and millions like me, you know, going into a country where the rule of law appears to be shaky, to put it politely, where you've probably got into rather difficult conversations with people with, I think you used the phrase swivel-eyed earlier. There seem to be an awful lot of them around. And as you say, where all kinds of unpleasant things happen if you don't have a US passport and the US administration decides they don't like you. Yes, I mean, I don't think I'd sort of turn down a plausible invitation to a worthwhile event in the United States, but I'm not rushing to go there on holiday, no.
And you're not alone there, John. And just, Kate, does it strike... I know there's any number of things that could strike somebody as odd about America at the moment, but does it strike you that as especially odd that the Republican Party, the party of business, led by the self-styled great businessman and great deal maker, is not more concerned by the fact that flight bookings to the US are down 11% year on year this past April, which is inflated somewhat by the fact that flight bookings from Canada are down 33% year on year. Oxford Economics, for one, is predicting an $8.5 billion drop-off in spending by tourists in the United States this year. That's quite a lot of money. You would think they'd be a bit more concerned, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but you remember Boris Johnson, what he said about business during the Brexit debate?
As reputedly so, yes.
F business. I mean, it is really surprising when parties that have always been the parties of business, supposedly, just decide they're not anymore. But I wonder if there is going to be a backlash eventually from voters if they finally decide that Trump's costing them money, because that seemed to be the main motivation for voting for him, that he was going to, you know, increase the money in their wallets.
I mean, if that backlash just finally on this, John, happens, like if the backlash happened tomorrow, though, this reputational damage and these numbers, 11% down in flight bookings year on year, that number again from Canada, 33%, how long does that take to come back?
A long time. The problem is that once you have deflected tourists for whatever reason, they won't just sit at home sulking. They'll go and find other destinations. And a lot of them will decide that, in fact, having made this great experiment, they actually prefer the other destination to the United States. And no, they won't come back. The damage to the US tourist industry is probably permanent.
John Everard and Kate Clark, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, 21st century Europe has suffered, indeed is suffering, a number of disruptive insurgencies by parties operating somewhere in the spectrum from populist nationalist to out-and-out fascist. One of the more disquieting erupted in Greece a bit over a decade ago. As Greece's economy unravelled, opportunity knocked for Golden Dawn, an unsavoury sack of seething cranks openly nostalgic for Greece's years of military dictatorship and even more openly hostile towards people they considered insufficiently Greek. The period is chronicled in a new book by Patrick Strickland, You Can Kill Each Other After I Leave: Refugees, Fascism and Bloodshed in Greece. I spoke to Patrick earlier and began by asking about the title and the character who uttered it.
The title comes from something a police officer said. In effect, what happened was in March 2018, a neo-Nazi group had firebombed an Afghan community center in central Athens. And the Afghans and some anti-racist activists a few days later held a protest just to kind of say, hey, we're not scared and we deserve our rights. Across the street, a group of Greek men were yelling at them, and it was getting kind of aggressive. And one of the refugees turned to a police officer who was there and said, can you make them stop? Like, we don't have any problem with these guys. We just want to have a demonstration. And the police officer said, you can kill each other after I leave. Just wait till I'm gone. And that title didn't come until late in the process. But when it occurred to me, I thought it kind of summed up quite a bit about the book.
Because it does tap into what is a depressing recurring theme of the book, the apparent reach that Golden Dawn had developed not just into Greek government, and they did at one point have a quantity of MPs in the Greek parliament, but into Greek law enforcement and into the Greek security services. Were you ever able to get a clear line on how deep that infiltration had got?
No, and I don't think anybody will ever have a full accounting of that. But one thing I can say with certainty is that there was a period in which refugees and migrants were scared to report hate crimes because they knew they would end up in a jail cell and possibly in the deportation process. That was between 2010 and 2013. Lots of people I spoke to told me that. And then there was another thing that happened alongside that was quite grim, where there's a lot of people have said over the years that they would call the police station, Greek people, if they had a complaint about someone, say a neighbor who was from Pakistan or somewhere, and say they wanted to complain about noise. And the police would tell them, in fact, call the Golden Dawn office. They'll handle it much quicker than we will.
The book does chart Golden Dawn's ascent, peak, and eventual and merciful decline and fall. They are now deemed a criminal organisation in Greece. Their leader of the period you're writing about and many others are all now in prison. But do you get the impression that they could have been stamped out earlier had the will been there? Or I guess what I'm asking is, one of the problems with combating the far right, that until there is a peak of obvious and flagrant violence, it's very difficult for authorities, even if they're willing and able, to tackle them directly.
Yeah, I do think that something could have been done much sooner. I mean, Pavlos Fyssas was murdered in September 2013, a Greek anti-fascist rapper. But Shahzad Lukman was a Pakistani migrant worker who was killed by two Golden Dawn supporters 9 months earlier, and the state didn't move against the organization itself. Bear in mind that a wave of violence really had been going on since 2010 in Athens and elsewhere. So, I mean, there was a long period of violence in which a lot of things were ignored by the state, and most anything that was pursued was treated as an individual case.
I mean, this is a dynamic that we've seen across the Western world in the last couple of decades especially. There's this idea at large among parties that like to think of themselves as sensible and respectable that if they take a harder line on immigration but do that, I guess, lawfully and properly, then it deflates the appeal of the far right. Do you think there's actually anything to that? I ask because I'm somewhat sceptical. My own view is that people attracted to the far right because of anger about immigration. If it wasn't immigration, they would find something else. It's the anger they enjoy.
I totally agree with you. Migration is a scapegoat. I mean, it's a very convenient one, but it's not a real explanation for why people are attracted to these kind of extreme fringes of the far right. I do not think that taking an incredibly hard line on migration or seeking harder borders is going to satisfy people on the radical right. And I think it's dangerous to chase them rightward, because once you say, I'm going to close the border, I'm going to seal the border off, you're setting yourself up for failure. And there will always be someone further to the right who can come in and offer a more severe and stricter and harsher proposal for how to handle migration and borders.
Was the intention of the book just finally that this was supposed to be a universal lesson? I mean, you're very punctilious in drawing links between modern Golden Dawn and Greece's actually quite recent history of outright police state military dictatorship. But could it happen anywhere? And I guess you're speaking to us from the United States. Is it happening anywhere?
One of the things I've said in book talk so far is that I really do feel like I could have written this book about so many different countries right now. We see a lot of similarities between what happened in Greece and other places. I think it could happen anywhere. What's happening in the United States right now has parallels in so many different places, but including in Greece. I mean, shipping people to a foreign prison, for instance, is not that unlike the way the Greek military junta, which was fascistic, no doubt, sent leftists and suspected leftists into internal exile on Greek islands. It's also not unlike the way that Greece has carried out pushbacks of people, which are basically extrajudicial expulsions of refugees and migrants, sometimes pushing their boats, for instance, back into international waters. That's resulted likely in sinkings at different times, shipwrecks, and just straight up sort of pushing people back across the land border with Turkey. At the same time, you look to the United States and asylum on the southern border has been suspended. There are a lot of parallels between Greece and the United States in that regard. And I think it's all over Europe and North America, to be honest.
That was Patrick Strickland speaking to me earlier. His new book, You Can Kill Each Other After I Leave, Refugees, Fascism and Bloodshed in Greece, is available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, John Everard and Kate Clark. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.